The knock on my door came at 3 in the morning, and nobody knocks at 3 in the morning unless something has gone wrong. I was awake anyway, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the delivery notice that had pinged my wrist unit an hour earlier. Package arriving ahead of schedule. That was strange enough on its own, since the HFY company had promised my new domestic unit would land sometime next week, not in the dead of night. But the knock itself was worse than strange. It was frantic. Quick, uneven raps, like someone was hitting the door with the side of a closed fist, over and over, too scared to stop. I grabbed the only thing near my bed that could pass for a weapon, a metal flashlight heavy enough to dent a wall, and I walked to the door barefoot, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I opened it, there was no crate, no sleek metal housekeeping unit standing at polite attention the way the catalog had promised. Instead, there was a girl, crouched low against my doorframe, breathing hard, her skin a pale shade of blue under the porch light, her eyes wide and silver, glancing behind her every few seconds like she expected something to come around the corner of the building. "Please," she said, her voice cracking on the word. "Please, let me inside." I did not think. I stepped back, and she moved past me so fast I barely saw her cross the threshold, and then she was pressed against the wall beside my door, one hand flat on the frame, listening. "What is going on?" I asked, my voice lower than I meant it to be. "Who are you? Are you hurt?" She held up a hand, asking for silence, and for 10 long seconds neither of us moved. I heard nothing outside except the wind and a dog barking somewhere down the street. Finally, she let out a breath and slid down until she was sitting on my floor, knees pulled to her chest, shaking. "They were supposed to take me to a facility," she said, "a processing center. I was cargo on a transport, and the transport made an emergency landing near here because of a storm, and while the crew argued about repairs, I ran." "Cargo?" I repeated. The word did not fit a person. "You mean you were a passenger?" She looked up at me, and something in her face made the truth land before she said it out loud. "No, I was listed as inventory. Domestic unit designation, model unclear, destination residential. There was a shipping tag on my wrist when they put me in the hold." She held up her arm. A thin plastic band circled her wrist, printed with a barcode and a string of numbers, and beneath the numbers, in small clean letters, it read, "Property of HFY Logistics. Do not open in transit." My stomach turned over. I had ordered a domestic unit from that exact company 8 months ago, saving every spare credit from 3 separate jobs, because I worked long hours and came home too tired to cook or clean, and the ads had promised a machine that would take care of both. I never once considered that somewhere behind the shiny advertisements, on some other part of the supply chain, a living person might be wearing a tag meant for a machine. "What's your name?" I asked. "Ithri," she said, "and you are the buyer. My manifest has your address printed on it." "That's why I ran here instead of anywhere else. I thought if I reached the delivery address before the crew radioed ahead, maybe you would not know what I was supposed to be, and you would just see a person standing at your door, and you would let me in before they arrived to correct the mistake." Correct the mistake? As if she were a wrong shipment that needed sorting. Outside, headlights swept across my window, slow and searching, then moved on. Ithri flinched at the light and pressed herself flatter against the wall, and in that moment, I made a decision without fully understanding what it would cost me. "Nobody is taking you anywhere," I said. "Not tonight, not tomorrow, not ever, unless you choose to go." She stared at me, like she did not believe the words could be real, and honestly, I was not sure I believed them either. But I meant them, and over the next several hours, as the sky slowly turned from black to gray outside my window, I learned exactly how deep the trouble went, and exactly how much danger I had just invited into my life. Her homeworld was called Farai, a small planet 3 jumps out from human space, one of dozens absorbed years earlier by a trade cartel that called itself the Consortium. The Consortium did not conquer worlds with weapons, it conquered them with debt. It arrived offering infrastructure, medicine, technology, and it left behind invoices that grew faster than any economy could repay. When Farai fell behind on its payments, the Consortium began collecting in a different currency. Labor contracts, they called them. People signed away, sometimes willingly under pressure, sometimes simply taken from processing queues and reclassified. HFY had been 14 when the reclassification notice arrived for her family. She was 19 now. 5 years of her life had been spent moving between holding facilities, each one promising the next stop would be the last, each one lying. "The manifest error is the only reason I am sitting in your home right now," she said, once the sun was fully up, and I had made her something to eat, though she barely touched it. A clerk somewhere typed the wrong classification code, domestic unit, instead of contracted labor. It routed me through commercial shipping instead of the transport lines, and commercial shipping has fewer guards, and the guards it does have are lazy, because they think they are only watching boxes. "So they'll notice the mistake eventually," I said. "They already have," she said quietly. That is what the message on my wrist display said, before I smashed it against the wall outside your door. I looked down and saw, for the first time, the cracked display strapped beneath the shipping tag, its screen dark and split down the middle. We did not have much time. That was clear enough. What was less clear was what to do about it, since neither of us had any real power against a cartel that owned transport lines and processing centers, and, apparently, the loyalty of enough officials to make its filing errors disappear quietly and often. I called in sick to work that day, and the day after, and I stopped answering messages from anyone who was not either my sister or my landlord. HFY stayed inside, moving only between rooms without windows facing the street, and every time a car slowed anywhere near my building, she went rigid and silent, counting seconds until it passed. On the third day, a man came to my door wearing a HFY logistics uniform, polite and smiling in the practiced way of someone paid to smile no matter what he was actually there to do. "Good afternoon," he said, when I opened the door only as far as the chain would allow. "We believe a shipment intended for your address was misrouted. A domestic unit, delivered in error to a temporary storage location nearby. We're simply following up to see if it arrived at your residence, since our tracking shows some irregularity." "No unit arrived here," I said, keeping my voice as flat and bored as I could manage. "I actually canceled that order last month. Budget issues." He studied me for a moment longer than felt comfortable, then nodded, thanked me for my time, and left. I watched through the window as he stood at the end of my walkway and made a call, glancing back toward my house twice before he finally walked away. HFY had been listening from the hallway, and when I closed the door, she let out a breath she must have been holding the entire time. "They will not stop," she said. "A missing unit on a manifest is a financial loss they can write off. But I am not a unit, I am a person who ran, and if word of that spreads, other people in other holding facilities might start believing they can run too. They cannot afford that. They will keep looking." I sat down across from her at my small kitchen table, and for the first time since she had arrived, I asked the question that had been sitting underneath every other thought in my head. "What do you want to do?" She blinked, like the question itself was unfamiliar. "What do you mean?" "I mean, if nobody was chasing you, if there were no cartel and no manifest and no shipping tag, what would you actually want?" She was quiet for a long moment, turning the cracked wrist display over in her fingers. "I want to tell someone what is happening, not just about me, about everyone still in those facilities. I want someone with power in this part of space to hear it and actually do something, instead of writing it off as an administrative error." That gave me an idea, small at first, then growing larger the more I thought about it. I did not have power. I was a warehouse technician with a modest apartment and a canceled order, and not much else. But I knew someone who might. My sister, Claire, worked as a research assistant for a woman named Elena Voss, a journalist who had built a career on stories nobody else wanted to touch: corporate corruption, supply chain fraud, cases that big companies paid a great deal of money to keep quiet. If anyone would know how to turn one frightened girl's testimony into something the consortium could not simply erase, it would be her. I called Claire that evening, keeping the conversation vague until I could explain everything in person, and 2 days later, Elena Voss sat across from HFY in my living room with a small recorder between them, and HFY talked for almost 3 hours straight, describing everything from the reclassification notices to the conditions inside the holding facilities to the names of officials who had signed off on shipments they must have known were not really shipments of goods. Elena did not say much during that time. She mostly listened, her expression growing harder and more focused with every new detail, and near the end, she looked up at me and said, "This is bigger than an apartment can hold. If we're doing this, we're doing it carefully, and we're doing it fast, because the moment this story starts moving, they will move faster to bury it." The next 2 weeks were the most frightening of my life, and I do not say that lightly, because the days leading up to them had already involved a stranger showing up at my door in the middle of the night. Elena worked quietly, gathering records, cross-referencing shipping manifests, reaching out to contacts inside the regional trade authority who owed her favors from stories she had helped them with in the past. HFY stayed hidden, moving between my apartment and a safe house Elena arranged, never in one place longer than a few days. I kept working my normal shifts, trying to act as if nothing had changed, though every knock on my door still made my chest tighten, and every unfamiliar car on my street earned a long, careful look before I let myself relax. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, without warning, across 3 major networks at once, timed that way on purpose, so no single outlet could be pressured into pulling it before the others aired. Elena had built the report around HFY's testimony, backed by leaked manifests showing hundreds of individuals reclassified as domestic units and shipped through commercial channels meant for furniture and appliances. She included interviews with 2 other people who had escaped similar facilities years earlier and had been living quietly, afraid to speak until they saw that someone else had already taken the risk. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, HFY Logistics issued a statement calling the report a misunderstanding of standard labor contract procedures, which only made things worse, since it confirmed the existence of the very system HFY had described. By the end of the day, 3 separate regional authorities had opened investigations, and by the end of the week, a formal hearing had been scheduled before an interstellar trade tribunal, the kind of body that rarely moved quickly on anything, but could not easily ignore a scandal already playing across every major network. HFY was asked to testify in person, and she agreed before I even finished explaining what that would involve. "I have spent 5 years being moved from place to place without anyone asking what I wanted," she said. "This time, I am choosing to go." The hearing took place in a tall glass building in the Capital District, filled with officials from a dozen different governments and organizations, all seated in tiered rows facing a central podium. I sat in the gallery with Claire and Elena, watching HFY stand alone at that podium, small against the size of the room, her cracked wrist display sitting on the table beside her as evidence, the barcode still visible beneath the shattered screen. She spoke for almost 20 minutes without notes. She described the reclassification notice that arrived when she was 14. She described the holding facilities, the transport lines, the quiet, bureaucratic cruelty of being logged as inventory instead of a person. She described running through a storm in the dark and knocking on the door of a stranger's home because it was the only address she had, and the terror of not knowing whether that stranger would help her or turn her away. Near the end, her voice steadied, and she looked directly at the row of consortium representatives seated near the front. "I am not asking for sympathy," she said. "I am asking you to look at the manifests, look at the numbers, count how many names are listed as units instead of people, and then explain to this room why that classification exists at all, if not to make it easier to move people without anyone asking questions." Nobody in that room had an answer for her, not one that held up under the weight of the evidence Elena had gathered. The tribunal adjourned that day without a final ruling, but within a month, sanctions were placed on HFY Logistics, severe enough to freeze major parts of its shipping operations, and a joint task force was formed to review every manifest the company had filed over the previous 5 years. It took the better part of a year, but eventually, more than 11,000 people were located and released from facilities across a dozen worlds, their classification codes corrected, their names restored to something other than inventory numbers. HFY's testimony was cited directly in the final report as the turning point that made the investigation possible. Through all of it, she stayed with me, though the reasons shifted over time. In the beginning, it was because she had nowhere else that felt safe. Later, after the sanctions and the hearings, and the slow unraveling of the consortium's shipping fraud, it was because she wanted to be, and because I wanted her to stay too, and neither of us needed a formal reason beyond that. She got her own room eventually, then her own small business helping other survivors navigate the confusing process of having their records corrected, a task she understood better than any official ever could, since she had lived every step of it herself. My apartment, small as it was, slowly filled with things that were hers and not mine. Books in a language I was only beginning to learn, a plant she kept insisting would grow better if I stopped checking on it every day, a second chair at my kitchen table that had not existed before that first frantic knock in the middle of the night. People still ask me sometimes about the domestic unit I ordered all those months ago, the one I saved for through 3 jobs and 8 long months, the one that never arrived. I tell them the truth. It never showed up. The company that sold it to me collapsed under the weight of its own fraud before it ever fulfilled the order, and honestly, I never asked for a refund. I did not need one. What arrived at my door instead was not a machine built to serve without complaint. It was a person who chose, every single day after that first terrified knock, to stay somewhere she was finally seen as more than a line on a shipping manifest. And some nights, when the apartment is quiet, and the only sound is the low hum of the city outside the window, I think about how close I came to sleeping through that knock entirely, how easily I could have stayed in bed and let the sound fade into the wind, and I wonder how different both our lives would have turned out if I had. But I did not stay in bed. I got up, and I opened the door, and everything after that followed from a choice made in the space of a single moment, standing barefoot on a cold floor at 3 in the morning, deciding that whatever was on the other side of that door deserved to be let in,